Welcome back to Audiobooks by H.G. Schuler. Earth Chronicles, Book 1, The Fifth Pinnacle, Chapter 8, 19th Century Tallahassee. The moonlight touched them across their shoulders as they stepped up to the carriage. They hesitated before climbing aboard, turning instead towards a street lamp, where a man stood twirling a walking stick in one hand. Upon seeing Grace and James staring at him, he bent his head down a little, touching the top of his hat with the ivory head of his stick in a gesture of goodbye. When he did this, his face came out of shadow into the light, identifying him as a much younger version of old Jack. Beneath the street lamp, he pulls at a chain attached to his trousers, looks at his watch, which says 10 o'clock, then turns, slowly disappearing into the dark. After his departure, the regenerated couple step up into the carriage, carrying with them abilities and youthfulness that are astounding. "How long do you think before he figures it out?" Grace asked while taking James' hand into her own. She was looking up at the stars. A group of them shone brightly while taking possession of the night sky. "I've given him steps that are time-consuming and confusing. He's so full of himself that he'll keep trying. He's not thinking at all or suspecting anything. He thinks the world revolves only around him. Probably after a few months he'll realize he's been tricked, but it doesn't matter. The formula's safe, and so are we. No one will ever think to look for us in Tallahassee." Ralph Waldo Emerson recently called it a grotesque piece of land. It's just that it's still a little wild is all. Reports are that it's full of beautiful rolling hills and has ample sources of water. Because of these attractions, it's become the destination for many. Northern planters from the areas of Virginia, Georgia, North and South Carolina have arrived in considerable numbers. Some of these have already started up cotton and sugar plantations, and it's only going to continue. There's still a large Native American population, but it's been near 10 years since General Andrew Jackson fought those two skirmishes against the Seminoles. It's known to harbor runaway slaves, but I think it's ready to grow into a real town. I like the thought of growing up with the frontier capital of Florida. It's not a state, but that's only a matter of time. They've had territorial status for 6 years now. They're entering a new period, a new beginning, and Grace, so are we. James' voice fell silent as the horse-drawn carriage moved briskly over the brick streets of a city just starting to slumber. The young couple sat quietly, watching the tranquil splendor of the moon. The carriage crept closer to the bustling and famous New York harbor, where they had booked passage to the city of St. Augustine. From there, they would travel by coach to Tallahassee. The things in their possession were not many. They brought only their clothes, a few toiletries, the formula, and themselves. Everything else could be replaced upon arrival. They could not have been more pleased 6 weeks later after getting situated. The stories about the beauty of the surrounding areas were true. The land was softly rolling, the vegetation colorful, lush, and bright, and the soil was next to perfect for growing. Farm animals were easily available, in good health, and affordable. However, the town itself was nothing more than a heap of unfinished boards and Georgia red clay bricks. Newer, more polished buildings were just starting to pop up, but it was obvious that it would take another 10 years before this town would look like a real city. The boarding house where they settled didn't give a good first impression either. Its walls needed whitewashing, and the living room and front porch were still littered with dishes from a sizable, enthusiastic gathering of people. From the ceilings hung red glitter and green, illuminated masks left over from the new celebration called Mardi Gras. A good deal of the house showed signs of the party, pointing out that efforts to clean it had been neglected. There was a rather large contingent living here from New Orleans, and they had rented the place for the event a week earlier. At night, there were snatches of band music that would float through the streets, creeping into any open windows. Unfortunately, keeping windows shut at night was not an option due to the heat. So Grace quickly learned to hang cheesecloth over the openings to keep the immense number of bugs out. Behind the boarding house were 2 unkempt, dusky gardens. In between them was a pretty stream, good for sitting, listening, and meditating, or for reading. The area hadn't progressed as far into peace and solitude as they had expected. But this was the world, the time and place. This was 1827 Tallahassee. Take it or leave it. James and Grace decided to take it and to make the best of it. In no time, James had met a man through the Mercantile Association and contracted him to build a 2-story, 6-bedroom house on a 5,000-acre tract of property he had purchased. The land was part of the fields the Seminole Indians had abandoned years before after their battle with General Andrew Jackson. Plans for a Capitol building and other government buildings were already on the drawing boards at an adjacent location. James and Grace would soon have plenty of space for a new facility to regenerate and temporarily house more people. For a year, Grace watched James' almost unbearable gaze. He was overseeing the construction, fumbling around, and walking back and forth with such determination that at times he appeared to be fleeing. After leaving New York, what remained of his pride was solely focused on his justification for his work. The workers began to regard him as someone who knew the construction trade well. Part of this was his attire, which usually consisted of suit and tie, making him appear several years older. Another reason was his demeanor. "Come here" was a regular phrase of his, as he pointed out changes or intricate details he wanted to be done to the house. He fired more men than he allowed to stay and work. When it was all done, he had exactly what he had envisioned, a place to live that would double as a facility to work in. Afterward, he was overseeing the construction of a barn and lean-to when Grace shouted from the steps of their new house, "James, come over here." She had purchased several rocking chairs and wanted help lining them up on the porch. When he moved in her direction, his approach was slow, like a man brooding or possibly in the middle of some sort of desperate calculation. She noticed this about him, and that he wasn't looking at her. When he finally reached the porch, she was growing concerned. "Will you sit down? We have chairs now, and I've made lemonade. We don't have any ice, but I have an icebox coming from the Mercantile later today. They tell me they have ice delivery once a week, or twice weekly if we like. It's too far out for daily delivery, but..." James puts his hand up to her mouth and abruptly stops her from talking. He seems to know exactly what he's doing. "There's a preacher here. I asked about him a few days ago, and he already has come to see me." She moves his hand away. "What are you trying to tell me? James Jenkins?" He watched her push her long blonde hair behind her ears. Her eyes watched him too. "I got something," he said, while backing down the steps and piddling with what sounded like change in his pocket. "And when I get it..." He pulls out what seems to be about 15 or 20 cents. Then he stops, reaches into his other pocket, and pulls out another round object. This one happens to have a diamond attached to it. They stand motionless, looking at one another. "From the time I first met you, I never worried." His voice had begun to rise. "Sorry, that's not what I meant to say." He hesitates to clear his throat. "I've never given you any reason to worry. Have I, Grace? Tell me that." "No, James, I never have worried." He had knelt. One knee now rested on the second step of their house. "I reckon you could have any man you wanted." His face looked whiter than usual, grave, like he was hollow with no words left in him. He looks up into the sun for a moment, and when he looks back at her, his eyes are more deliberate. "For a fact, you could have any man." She was trying to hold back, trying not to force him. "I don't want any other man, James. I didn't mean to keep you waiting. It's just that I have enemies. It's all taken care of now. I'm quite sure. Grace, my beautiful darling, will you marry me?" "I will marry you, James." She watched him stand up and climb 2 steps to the porch. He places the engagement ring on her finger. Then she stands on her tiptoes and kisses him on the lips. Later, after discussing the wedding arrangements over a meal of greens and field peas, James walks outside into the yard. He motions to one of the hired workers. A man of around 25 sprints up to him. "Yes, sir, Mr. Jenkins. You need me?" "It's Joe. No, Jim, is that right?" "Jim's my brother. I'm Mike Love. My uncle once almost came to blows with Andrew Jackson. They nearly dueled. If it weren't for their seconds, they would have. You might have heard about it. It was the talk of the town a year ago." "No, Mike, I hadn't heard. I know that you're quite busy right now. The thing is, I need to send a message to town. Is there one of the workers that can do that? I'll pay him for his trouble. Will you be waiting for a return message, sir? Yes. It's near 8 miles, could be 2 or 3 hours getting back, maybe more, depending on how long it takes to find the recipient and retrieve his response. Yes, I figure as much. Can you do it? Or is there someone else? I'll do it, sir. Just let me get my horse. Oh, who might this message be going to? Do you know the little white church west of the sawmill? You mean Preacher Tom's place. My mother knows him well. That's the one. Just ask him if he could be at my house tomorrow at noon. He'll know what you're talking about. Paralleling the house was a small garden of corn and squash. Grace had planted it earlier in the summer. Beyond that was a few nice shade trees where workers' horses were tied off. After walking with a swift gait, Mike stood a while longer, strapping his saddle to his horse. Placing his left foot in the stirrup, he sways back slightly and swings himself over the animal. He points it sharply toward town, and after he's rode a short distance, disappears into a field of tall grass. When Preacher Tom emerges from a patch of woods the next day, he jerks the reins hard, turning onto a well-worn path and rides quickly up to the house. His horse is panting noticeably. The last 2 miles of the trip, he had been riding him hard. He doesn't wait for the animal to come to a complete stop before jumping off. He screams, "I saw Indians." He runs up the steps of the porch. "I saw Indians. They were hiding, watching me as I passed. But I saw them just as clear as I see you, James." "How far away?" James asked, looking into the distance. 2 miles, maybe less. Over near the big poplar. You know the one. Yes. That area is a sort of known right-of-way for the Seminole. After they deserted the land here, they would still use it, at times crossing over from South Georgia to the Atlantic Ocean. Strange, though, because I was told when I purchased this land at the government outpost in Pensacola that they haven't crossed through in near 4 years. That would be about 5 years today. I wouldn't worry too much about it, though, Tom. They'll probably be moved on by the time you head back that way. The wedding was as simple as they come. Grace stood in a pretty yellow dress that covered her ankles. It was set off by white fringe surrounding the neckline and long flowing sleeves. Her hands were cupped together and filled with wild flowers, black-eyed Susan. James was dressed in his fanciest, most posh, 3-piece suit. Its grand, deep blue color generously added to the beauty of the event. The young couple looked splendid, standing next to one another. Other than Preacher Tom, there was only Mike and Jim, along with another hired worker, to witness the nuptials. There was no reception, no wedding cake, and other than tea and coffee, there were no refreshments. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the wedding had come and gone, attention already turning to other things. 2 days later, word came by mouth of the hired help that Preacher Tom never showed back up at his home. He had been found bludgeoned to death with a tomahawk, scalped, and his body purposely left along the trail to town. Tension was high in and around the Tallahassee area as other isolated attacks rose in volume over the next few months. Eventually, this led to the burning of 12 homesteads and the massacre of 50 people. The Seminole Nation made it abundantly clear that the uprising was a direct retaliation to Andrew Jackson's aggression against them. For the next 8 years, the situation would die down and start up again until an all-out war against the Seminoles started in 1837. The war lasted through 1845 and resulted in the death of many Indians. Many others were relocated to the Oklahoma Territory. Afterwards, problems with the once mighty Seminole Nation ended. However, during this troublesome time of war, there was an incident at the Jenkins house that brought back to light the youthfulness and incredible abilities of the ageless couple. One day, Grace walked from the kitchen into the living room and was instantly seized by fear. She was looking into the face of a Seminole Indian. Looking around the room, she realized there were at least 10 others. "James," she shouted, "you need to come out here right away." "What's the matter, Grace?" he shouted back, running from the kitchen into the living room. Almost immediately, one of the Indians lifted his arm, tomahawk in hand, and ran at James. In what could be labeled a reflex move, James threw up his hand, a white illumination already shooting out from him. He caught the Indian's arm just below the wrist. Without time to think, and with no strain whatsoever, he bends the arm backward, sending a sharp, cracking sound shooting through the room. The arm is broken in two, a jagged bone protruding out of the flesh. Another Indian lunges at James, tomahawk up high, but in less than 5 seconds, he endures the same results. The two red men lay on the floor moaning in horrific pain, blood running from their twisted, punctured flesh. One of the Indians, standing separate from the others, reaches out his arm as if to halt any further attacks on James. After this is made clear, he motions with his head at Grace. In response, 2 Indians move toward her. She has already been made hysterical by what she's seen. Frightened, she swings both her hands up in the stop position and screams. No, unaware that her adrenaline has spiked, and an involuntary mass of energy has been building inside of her. All at once, the energy jolts from her hands, forming a white sphere and blowing the 2 Indians off their feet into the living room wall. 3 more Indians react, stepping straight towards Grace. Again, she throws up her hands, and an even greater amount of energy is released. This time, the energy springs out, floating like unsteady heat rising from a road, engulfing the 3 red men and elevating them off the floor. When Grace moves her arms, the hapless men move through the air, mimicking her arm's direction. They are now completely under her shaky, trembling control. Scared and unsure as to what to do next, she hesitated, but then stepped forward. When she does, the men are hurled backward, crashing through a tall, double-sized window, landing on the porch decking. The white ball of energy now quickly dissipates. The Indian that has been giving directions suddenly drops to his knees. His face mirrors something horrific and subterraneous. When it clears, he takes his finger and mimics the drawing of a man and woman. Following this, he raises both hands up high, palms toward the ceiling, and moves his head upwards, acting as if he's looking into the sky. Over the course of the next 2 minutes, he chants words that seem like an Indian ritual or song. When he stands, he takes a small, hollowed-out piece of wood from a leather pouch hanging around his chest and hands it to James. It turns out to be a pipe, a symbol of peace between them. The Indians mount their horses and ride away with no further hostilities. The next day, James and Grace spot smoke rising a few miles from the house. When they go to investigate, they find a bloody massacre. All the Indians that had entered their house the day before were dead, along with many others. Some of the bodies were contorted from attempting to run from the hail of bullets. The hairy desperation still clinging like wild plankton to their faces. The U.S. cavalry had caught up with them after an attack on French settlers about 10 miles away. Later, an Indian interpreter tells James that the drawings the Indian had made on the floor of their house meant the Seminoles believed James and Grace have the spirit of the gods. Following the Seminole War, the 2 of them decide the area is now safe and the time is right to formulate the potion so they can inject and regenerate people again. It had been 18 years since they brought themselves and old Jack back from old age to youth. They agreed on a minimum age of 60, unless someone was in extremely poor health, and on no more or less than 5 people per year. This would be the number of bodies they could house and care for, while helping them integrate into the mid-1800s life in Tallahassee. They had 5 extra rooms in their house. After 1 complete year, a regenerated person would have to move into a place of his own to make room for the next. Their plan worked to perfection, and in 10 short years, the Tallahassee area had over 50 regenerated people walking its streets. In another 10 years, there were over 100. All their friends and every person involved in their lives were now regenerated people. The need to hide their age, which for a few years had been a concern, no longer existed.
That wraps up Chapter 8 of Earth Chronicles, Book 1, The Fifth Pinnacle. Stay tuned for Chapter 9 on audiobooks by H.E. Schuler, found only on YouTube.